Real quick before this video starts, if you're a fan of him, you know that SLAYDEN'S is actually working on an Automatons video as well, so go check that out as soon as it drops. Happy Halloween, everyone. I have once again come to analyze one of the greatest games of all time. Probably. As we know, Helldivers 2 has a bunch of enemies that would make for a great analysis. I already did the Terminids, and naturally, the next faction on the list for a biological analysis would be the bots? Yeah, well, I guess this video isn't exactly a biological analysis. However, I will be taking what I find to be an interesting approach at analyzing the second most prevalent faction in Helldivers, the Automatons. Now, you're probably thinking, what in the world are you even doing with this video? Bots aren't biological. Zero, have you finally lost it? And, well, no, I haven't gone crazy. Yet. See, evolution is primarily influenced through the means of natural selection, which is defined as the phenomenon where organisms of a particular species that are adapted better to survive in their environment will typically survive more than organisms of that same species that aren't as well adapted, and eventually replace them as the next iteration of that species. The unneeded parts for survival are discarded in favor of superior traits. Now, of course, this exact scenario can't occur with artificial machines. However, in a way, machines can be subject to a kind of unnatural selection, where each previous iteration is discarded in favor of one that allows it to complete its task as effectively as possible. Take the iPhone, for example. The iPhone 1 doesn't look all that different from the iPhone 2, as it only really added 3G functionality, along with some other internal changes. However, if we skipped forward to the 5th iPhone, the overall structure has gotten more rigid than round. The camera lens has gotten slightly larger, and again, several internal changes were made. The unneeded parts for the creator's intentions were discarded in favor of superior traits. Except in this case, the creator is actually the cyborgs designing their own children. Now, I won't be mentioning the cyborgs that much throughout this video, but they do form the basis of what allowed the Automatons to exist in the first place. See, they are a faction of secessionists from Super Earth that adopted many traits of a modern civilization, such as socialism and bombing civilians and big pieces of metal sticking out of their bodies. So they seceded from Super Earth and went to war, blah blah blah. They lost, and when they did, they were confined back to Cyberstan, where they were sent to the mines to toil endlessly for Super Earth. However, this endless period only lasted 100 years, because in that time, the cyborgs somehow fully completed the creation of their children and released them upon the Helldivers. How did they do this? I have no idea, as in the lore, the Automatons are said to have come from deep space, but if anyone has any theories on this, please let me know. I would actually love to hear about that. So, the Automatons are essentially an all-mechanical race of what I guess you could call organisms that are primarily made of various metals, presumably a mix of things like titanium and tungsten for heavier bots and steel for the lighter ones. Please note that my knowledge of metals is limited and these may or may not be accurate judgments. How they are powered, however, is something interesting to consider, as there are a few different theories about it, most of which are supported by the existence of automaton bioprocessors. See, the automatons have become much more brutal than their predecessors, the cyborgs. Rather than taking Super Earth rebels and converting them into half-machine, half-human abominations, instead they just kidnap whatever humans, civilian or not, that happen to be on the planet that they invade and grind them up in a blender. What they do with this is what I'd like to consider. Now, it was confirmed by a hopefully reliable developer, I don't really know much about the developers of Helldivers or who does what or anything, that automatons don't have brains, as that would make them cyborgs. I would be willing to argue with that for ages, but that's not why I'm here. So, with the existence of bioprocessors, I personally believe that the cyborgs are actually powered by human blood. Or more accurately, biomatter, which would explain the reddish color liquid that explodes out of the trooper units when shot, as well as the same colored tubes around their body. However, if that still crosses into the range of cyborg territory, I would suggest that they instead use plain old biofuel. We don't exactly have a real-world equivalent to whatever the automatons are using to convert human blood into biological fuel, but you could say that we get close with the way that we deconstruct plants and other biological materials before upgrading the parts that the deconstruction results in. Additionally, another theory for the bioprocessors is that they don't take brains and put them inside automatons, but instead, they harvest brains for the purpose of modeling computers after them. We should remember that the greatest computer of all time, at least in human history, is the human brain, as it has gone through what could be considered trillions of iterations, each hopefully better than the last due to natural selection. Now, aside from this power source, of course, a cornerstone of the automatons are their weapons, which, upon a first glance, look like laser weapons, but that's actually a misconception popularized by none other than Star Wars, which does have its own in-universe explanation for this. See, lasers are supposed to generate an extremely intense beam of light, which, of course, has to go at the speed of light. The lasers that the Helldivers have are a lot more accurate to this description. On the other hand, I don't think the automatons use true lasers, but rather they use plasma guns, which are essentially guns that primarily consist of a power source and a gas container. Pulling the trigger, or just issuing a signal to shoot the gun, will cause the power source to superheat the gas, converting it into the fourth state of matter, plasma. This plasma is then somehow propelled out of the gun at a speed that is perceptible to the human eye. This is made more evident by the fact that the automaton weaponry is often referred to with the prefix fusion, in the wiki at least. Assuming this is credible, which that is what I will be assuming since it doesn't really make that much of a difference, it seems like whatever this power source that superheats the gas is uses fusion energy, which is absurdly complicated, so if you want to know more about it, go read about it on Wikipedia or something, I don't know. On the topic of gunfire, most automatons are actually affected by suppressing fire. When shot at for extended periods of time, many automatons will lose accuracy. Just really lose accuracy. Like, how can you be this bad at aiming? This points towards a capacity to feel fear, which then opens the gateway to the feeling of other emotions. This tells us that the automatons are a slight bit more human than we think. Additionally, the automatons have many voice lines that aren't just techno gibberish. I'm going to talk about them more later in this video, but here are some examples. Finally, before we start analyzing, as I did in my last video, I've made a diagram that shows what I personally believe to be how the automaton units are connected to each other, and will be what I use for the remainder of this video. I've split them into 3 tiers, the light, medium, and heavy tier, the first of which that we'll be covering is, of course, the light tier. The first thing we notice upon observing the trooper is its distinct skull-shaped head, which is plated with bright metal on its front and darker metal on the sides. The eye sockets are filled out by 2 bright red visual sensors. This bright red color is possibly illuminated by the primary power source of this bot. The areas where the nose and mouth would be have teeth-like structures. It's hard to see in this ripped model, but the image shows it quite clearly. This may be a pointer to a need for consumption of food. That is unlikely though, and it's probably an intimidation technique. I also expect that the trooper's voice box is located behind those teeth. The back of its head seems to have some kind of vent illuminated by the power source, which is likely there for the purpose of avoiding overheat. Extending down from the head, we see a large variety of tubes, or wires, that go on to run across the entire body. Now, I don't really know much about robotics, but it seems like this is either a kind of hydraulics or just really thick wires. I find hydraulics to be the more likely option, as that flows nicely, no pun intended, into the theory of somehow using the biomatter from the bioprocessors as what powers them. Now, in modern day, hydraulics, as opposed to what the name suggests, don't really use water all that much. Instead, they use different kinds of custom synthesized hydraulic oils, which provide lubrication. Maybe the automatons have found a way to synthesize a usable hydraulic oil out of the biomatters that humans can be broken down into. Another possibility is that this is a form of pneumatics, which is the use of gases in mechanical systems. The automatons may have found a way to convert the biomatter into, again, a usable gas for pneumatic applications. Otherwise, they could just be really thick cables of electricity or something that's generated with a standard biofuel generator or something. I don't know. As we move down to the torso, we see a lot more metal plating and tubes, but most notably, on its back we see two metal structures with a kind of metal grating or grill, which on the surface serves as more armor plating, but in truth, gives the trooper a kind of modularity, as it seems like this allows accessories like ammo boxes, jetpacks, and flammable gas containers to simply be slid on. This is probably put in place for cost efficiency in terms of resources, and is probably what leads to the major weaknesses regarding these three attachments, which is, of course, their tendency to explode. This kind of modularity probably makes the assembly process in the fabricators much easier and shorter to produce as much cannon fodder as possible. Now, when we look at its arms, we see joints which, based on my limited understanding of robotics upon light research, are classified as revolute joints, or joints that allow rotation on a fixed axis. Now, this would obviously be limiting, as a single axis is, well, it's a single axis. However, while the elbow joint is like this, the shoulder joint seems to be a revolute joint attached to another joint, which I also assume is a revolute joint, which allows for a rotation around two axes. Still limiting, but better than nothing. Additionally, all this talk of joints is also kind of pointless because we see the Rocket Raider bend its elbow in a way that is not in the single axis. So I guess they just do it a different way, and I do not know how. So someone please let me know in the comments, because I have no idea how they bend their elbows like this. Moving down to the legs, they seem to be connected to the torso by a kind of swivel, and use the same kind of joints. These legs would be classified as digitigrade, which in present-day robotics is useful for stability, speed, and something not a lot of people talk much about, storage efficiency. See, some real-world robots with digitigrade legs can fold them back when deactivated, which may immediately bring up images of the folded B-1 battle droids from Star Wars in your mind. In a similar way, I believe that the automaton troopers are designed to be folded in this way for better transportation. Using the Ragdoll Mover add-on in Gary's mod, I've surmised that it would be folded in the way you see on screen here. Keep in mind that this is just my estimate though, based on my own idea of what would make sense. It could be folded any other way, like this. The trooper wields what is often referred to as a fusion rifle on the wiki, which fires in 5-round bursts before it needs to cool down. The appearance of this gun shows how it's a plasma weapon. We see it consists of 3 primary parts: the heat source, the gas canister, and the barrel. The heat source seems to be the same kind of power source that most automatons utilize, although rather than a vent, this weapon has what I believe to be a heat sink in order to cool down. There are tubes running to and from this power source to the midsection of the gun, which I believe to be a gas canister. Interestingly, the trigger is actually off to the right side rather than the back, which is an interesting way of compacting this gun. Now, I assume that with every trigger pull, the heat source will emit a mass amount of heat, hot enough to convert gas into plasma, and shoot that heat into the gas canister. Then, as plasma forms, I believe that a small hole or slit that leads into the barrel will open, and the momentum of the sudden blast of heat into the gas chamber will propel the plasma out of the barrel. The trooper's behavior in-game is pretty basic. It tries to keep its distance from the enemy. When said enemy gets too close, it punches, and when the enemy tries to hide, it throws grenades to flush the enemy out of cover. Overall, the trooper is a simply, yet thoughtfully designed automaton that truly does what anyone would ask of a robot. It gets the job done. As a result of its useful nature, the trooper is a dynamic unit which can be adjusted in a bunch of ways. One such variation is the Brawler, which is essentially the same as the trooper, but with 2 giant swords attached to both of its arms. These swords seem to be made of 2 blades of some kind of material or alloy connected to 2 power sources that heat these blades to what I can assume to be extremely high temperatures. I'm not entirely sure what this material is, but I can assume that it's made out of some kind of tungsten, or maybe just plain old steel, as both of those have melting points that are far into the range of the kind of thing that would sear human flesh. Something notable about the Brawler is, well, it's quite dumb. This unit doesn't have much in the way of intelligence, aside from the ability to man machine gun emplacements for some reason. At least that's what the wiki says, because, well, you know, he doesn't seem like he would really have the ability to, you know, operate any kind of a handheld machine, you know? This lack of intelligence makes sense, as I would suppose that most automatons are programmed with preset functions rather than machine learning or neural networks. Well, while yeah, they still probably have those, they seem to be able to show some emotion and, you know, they still need to adapt to situations. We should still consider that they are assembled on open battlefields with portable fabricators. It would be far more efficient to have these guys come out with maybe millions of lines of code, if they even use code in the first place, that already allow it to know how to do things that it specifically needs to do, rather than programming that allows it to naturally learn how to do all those things over time, as cool as that idea sounds. In all likelihood, it's probably a combination of both. My primary theory is that when automaton troopers are fabricated, and when any automaton is fabricated, they are made with a pre-made set of code that tells it how to complete the tasks it was designed for, and also allows in part for it to learn and feel. With that tangent aside, this topic will come up later, so just keep in mind that the programming of each automaton is likely to be unique to its purpose. Another variant of the base trooper is the Rocket Raider. This is, again, a standard trooper, but with a big rocket launcher on top of its shoulder. Its behavior is standard, as expected. The only really interesting thing about it is the rocket itself, which seems to have a kind of user interface. One would assume that this is to lock onto the enemy, but of course, these Rocket Raiders don't exactly have the greatest accuracy. My best guess is that these work as a kind of iron sight or reflex sight or something, but it is unconfirmed, and, you know, I would assume that the automaton's vision itself has a user interface built into it, but otherwise, the rocket launcher design is kind of standard. It has a shoulder pad for recoil control, a vertical foregrip for even more recoil control, and a seemingly standard loading mechanism. The next variant of the trooper is one that is far more interesting, as it's the first major point of evidence that one thinks of when asserting that the automatons have a kind of sapience. In other words, the ability to be wise, and to understand complex situations beyond oneself. The existence of a Commissar, or otherwise any other kind of military leader, potentially shows that automatons have traits such as the ability to learn and reason and become wiser on the battlefield. On the PlayStation page, they are stated to be a mere simulation of military leadership, with slightly faster processing power than their comrades. However, I believe that whatever code that these particular machines possess is far more advanced than whatever Super Earth propaganda tells us. One thing that I'm sure you know about the Commissar is their ability to rally the surrounding automaton units to chant with them in a marching cadence. I find that this, in some way, puts the Commissar into a position that, in a way, could be compared to present-day drill sergeants, or otherwise a unit that ranks above its peers and possibly helps train them, somehow. I guess in this case, the quote-unquote training would be future troopers being based on the code of experienced Commissars. More likely, though, since the automatons are still fabricated on the spot, it could be true that the Commissar unit could be extensively used in alternative situations, particularly within automaton command centers such as ships or bases. I would consider that, toward the more advanced automaton units, the Commissars would be able to remotely command them. While it's fragile, these units can even bring whole factory striders into their marching cadence, leading me to believe that their kind are the units that directly deploy automaton forces on their side of the galactic war, aside from the cyborgs, who I believe are still in control of everything. The weapon that the Commissar sports is, of course, the same kind of weapon as all the rest, a fusion firearm. However, this one is a pistol of a much smaller size. This means that the fusion power source and gas storage device must be smaller, and thus must result in a far less heated projectile that lasts for a shorter amount of time before dissipating back into gas. This isn't really that much reflected in gameplay though, likely due to how significant of a difference this would be in combat. Additionally, while never used, the pistol also seems to have two railings, likely used for laser attachments and flashlights, and some small trivia that I haven't seen discussed much, likely because it's quite obvious. The Commissar seems to be very directly inspired by the Commissar from Warhammer 40k, who has a bolt pistol that looks very similar to this one. Our next automaton is seemingly the direct step up from the base trooper. The Marauder is a trooper that has been upgraded in physicality through extra armor on the shoulders, back, and face. It seems to have been upgraded technologically in some way as well, with several more tubes running along the chest. There really isn't much special about the Marauder, as it really is just a more buffed up trooper. One thing I've noticed is that these automatons tend to be operating machine gun emplacements more often, but that might just be by chance. The Marauder on its own seems to be purposeless, but their real purpose seems to be assigned to a position that we know as the MG Raider. This is, again, a standard Marauder unit that has been equipped with a portable fusion machine gun and a power pack strapped to its back. The machine gun itself seems to be a direct modification to the rifle that's been given a much longer barrel. I assume this barrel is to allow for a slightly longer projectile travel time, as the plasma will immediately begin to dissipate as it leaves the barrel, but I really don't know how effective this would be. As for the backpack, it has a sign with some text on it, and now I think would be a good time to say that the models in this Garry's Mod add-on are not exactly perfect. See, whoever made this add-on, I think, reflected the models in the case of the automatons, which is fine for the most part, as automatons are usually symmetrical anyway. However, it will sometimes result in artifacts like this, where the text on the MG Raider's backpack is mirrored, and thus incorrect. Mod creator, I don't know if you're watching this, but if you are, first of all, thank you so much for making this mod. It's literally the only reason why I can even make this video. And second of all, I don't know how mod creating in Garry's Mod works, but it'd be awesome if you fix this in some future update in some way. Now, the text on the back of the MG Raider's power pack, when translated from the automaton's own language, says everything for the collective. The power pack itself is designed for two purposes. For one, it's of course a power source, which allows the fusion machine gun to fire an additional 7 rounds from the rifle, making for a total of 12 rounds before needing to cool down. The MG Raider also seems to be the automaton's designated self-destructor, at least in the ranks of the troopers. At first, one may assume that the fuel rods sticking out like that are a mere design flaw. However, I propose that these are specifically placed near the head so that when an opposition attempts a headshot at close range, they mistakenly hit the fuel rod and initiate a self-destruction. Now, the troopers are, of course, not going to cut it when it comes to being the automaton's main infantry force. I would assume that they generally serve functional purposes, like operating heavy machinery, or keeping structures like fabricators operational. While this is the case, they do still have a viable combative use, and that use is through the Scout Strider. This automaton unit is composed of 3 parts: the cockpit, the power source, and the legs. The cockpit is made of large, heavy armor plates. One of these plates has a small slit that the piloting trooper can look through. Alongside that, it also has a twin-barreled fusion machine gun. This weaponry presumably works the same way as all the rest of the fusion weapons, that is to say a gas chamber and a power source, both of which are likely to be located in the midsection, which, accordingly, is the second most vulnerable part of the Scout Strider, although weaker calibers still cannot penetrate it. The most vulnerable part of this vehicle is the legs, which, oddly enough, are largely unarmored. Again, I assume that this isn't a direct design flaw, but rather an intentional trade-off for additional speed. As its name suggests, the Scout Strider likely sees a wider use in reconnaissance rather than active combat. If we take a look at some of this machine's finer details, we see a control system on the inner part of the cockpit. The steering mechanism, assuming it can be rotated, is, as far as I've researched, a butterfly steering wheel. Essentially, it's been divided into 2 handles that can be rotated either left or right. This is an assumption, but I think the pilot would push or pull these handles omnidirectionally, which would cause this structure here, that I assume is flexible, to bend in the direction that the pilot chooses, which would then send a signal to the Scout Strider's legs. As for the legs themselves, they are powered using the same techniques seen on the troopers, with wires that can be seen near the joints that make up their digitigrade limbs. A variation of the Scout Strider that's likely designed for more intensive reconnaissance situations is, well, the reinforced Scout Strider. It's not all that different from the original Scout Strider, only having extra armor protecting the pilot within, and a disposable 4-missile system that I presume must be loaded from an external source. What is primarily interesting about this unit is the fact that the pilot inside is essentially sealed within the cockpit, no method of entry or exit. Interestingly enough, it seems to be a slight call towards the inspiration that Helldivers takes from Warhammer 40k, in particular the Dreadnought. Now, when you see this thing, you obviously think about the Hulk. However, in 40k, a Dreadnought, to the extent of my knowledge of the extremely complex Warhammer lore, is a near-dead space marine, put inside of a box and sent to control a big box of metal, which, if you think about it, could be similar to what's happening here with the Scout Strider, a unit of a massive army which has been sealed inside a machine to more effectively engage in combat. Otherwise, it's only a mere upgrade to the Scout Strider. With that being said, we've reached the end of the light tier and the beginning of our next one, the medium tier, otherwise known as the Devastator tier because it's literally just Devastators. Our first unit of this tier is the Vanilla Devastator. This format dominates all of the medium tier as they are essentially the embodiment of medium infantry. If you have high ordnance, then they're dealt with easily, but units such as Super Earth's Armed Forces troopers don't have access to such ordnance that the Helldivers, essentially Super Earth's Special Forces, do. When using smaller arms, your best bet at killing these guys is with a clean headshot. The Devastators can retaliate though, using their integrated double-barrel fusion arm cannons. The choice to make them integrated shows that, unlike troopers, Devastators are likely not intended for any non-combative tasks, as missing an entire hand would be, quite unwieldy for such things as machine operation and construction. These fusion cannons are, again, likely to be plasma-based, in which case I believe that the power source would be here, and the gas chamber here. There are also 2 additional red attachments that I would assume are either auxiliary power sources or augments to make the weapon more powerful. The other arm is reserved for punching or other point-blank combative engagements. It has 2 fingers and an opposable thumb, as well as 2 blunt spikes above the hands for extra damage. The Devastator centerpiece has the first instance of automaton iconography directly inscribed onto the body of a unit. Above that, we see its head. For some reason, this ripped model has a red face plating, but the image and in-game footage confirms that this head is ordinarily the same color as the base trooper's head. This leads me to my next point. I believe that all the Devastator variants are based directly upon the earlier Trooper variants. This isn't a far-fetched theory, but it's not directly confirmed, so I'll just leave it out there. I believe that each Devastator variant is made based on the code, or programming, of whatever the automaton's equivalent to that is of the Troopers. You can see how I think this works with this diagram I made here. I assume that it would be more efficient to recycle the behavior of previous units that have that behavior built into them rather than start from scratch, but again, it's all speculation. Moving on from the base Devastator, we have the Rocket variant. This Devastator is extremely similar to the base Devastator, but what particularly sets it apart is the rocket pod mounted on its shoulder and back. The pod is mainly connected by 2 sets of wires plugged into the Devastator's midsection. This shows that the rocket pod is likely not an external attachment, but rather an actual direct implant into the structure of the Devastator itself, being wired to and powered by the Devastator's power source. As a result of this, it seems that an additional heatsink was added to the rocket pod so as to avoid overheating the main body. Now, the main rocket pod itself is split into 2 parts, the firing mechanism and the storage. The firing mechanism can store 12 rockets and fire them in salvos of 4. Interestingly, if we look at this animation of the Devastator firing, which is from an official Helldivers patch notes video, we see that they fire their rockets in a symmetrical pattern. I like that detail. It makes me feel a bit better about the fact that they don't fire them in rows of 3. Once the firing mechanism has been emptied, it reclines backward and connects to the storage, allowing for an additional 12 rockets. This totals the Rocket Devastator at a whopping 24 rockets, which doesn't sound like much on average, but can be significantly annoying when you have what feels like hundreds of them on the battlefield. Now, on the topic of the rockets themselves, when they are mid-air, they look like pretty standard rockets. However, on the firing mechanism of the Rocket Devastator itself, they have a gold color. It seems that before firing, these rockets are encased in some kind of container. I have no idea why they would do this, but if anyone does, please let me know in the comments, as it seems interesting. Aside from the rocket pod, the Rocket Devastator retains all the standard features that the base Devastator has, with the only exception being a small depiction of a gear on its head that is removed to make space for the firing mechanism. Similar can be said about our next Devastator variant, the Heavy Devastator. The Heavy Devastator is a variant with more significant augmentations, however, they seem to be far more modular and dynamic. It has an ammo pack fitted onto its back, which is interesting as the machine gun still fires what appears to be plasma. I would presume that this backpack would contain a power source, evident by the 3 heat sinks on it. The heat from this power is somehow transferred into the main gun through this belt-like mechanism, where it then heats up gas stored in the gun itself, creating plasma. This unit is amongst the most powerful infantry units of the current Automaton army. It can consistently fire devastating plasma bolts at a high rate for 3 seconds flat, with a 2-second cooldown. This, combined with their ballistic shield that has armor thickness of an actual tank, allows this bot to be one that should be a priority when neutralizing small infantry patrols, usually second to flare-firing troopers. While deadly, this unit was definitely designed with suppressing fire in mind, as it's not very accurate unless at close range. Otherwise, while dangerous, this is a relatively standard Devastator unit. The same cannot be said, however, for our final Devastator variant, the Berserker. I'll be honest, the Berserker is one of my favorite Automaton units, as it seems to have the most defined personality. What do I mean by that? Well... Additionally, it's characterized by having its hands replaced by 2 giant chainsaws, presumably powered by a similar energy source used in plasma weapons. Now, as we can see, this is not your average Devastator, and I would actually like to propose a theory as to how these units may be produced. Now, if you played or know about the original Helldivers, you know that there was a unit dubbed the Berserker which filled a similar role. This unit is said to have obsessively tweaked and modified themselves to become killing machines. One would assume that the Berserker has done the same, however, I believe this is not the case. Lore-wise, I believe the Berserker fills a role closer to the Grotesques, also from Helldivers 1. They seem to be made by the collection of automaton scraps on the battlefield, reassembled into these presumably cheap and easy-to-make units. This is what I believe to make the most sense, as it would be the most strategic move on the part of the automatons. Something that would make this even more beneficial is the effect on enemy morale. Not only would this unit be cheap to make, be made in larger quantities that scale with the size of battles, and be a positive result of failed automaton operations, but this unit in particular also has the capacity to terrify humans, most often keeping a variety of human skulls attached to the scrap metal that it uses to decorate its head. Overall, this is one of my personal favorite automaton units, and thus the conclusion to the medium tier. With that being said, we now move on to the big guys, the ones that everyone knows about, the Dreadnoughts, as some say, and, most of all, the Hulks. Hulks are the largest of the automaton units that could still fall under the categorization of quote-unquote infantry. They are bipedal units that are presumably the direct upgrades to the Devastators, even being as modular as those previous units, having multiple different options for weapons in particular. As of now, Hulks can only have flamethrowers, buzzsaws, fusion autocannons, and launchers, which can launch either missiles or firebombs if it's a part of the incineration core. Additionally, now's a great time to mention that in the first game, the cyborgs were heavily centric on how much one could mechanically alter their being. They used this concept to define their social hierarchy. Assuming that the automatons have some kind of sentience, it is likely that they would, of course, inherit this belief from their parents. With this, we can assume that Hulks are the most commemorated autonomous units among the automaton infantry ranks. This commemoration is displayed through several additional layers of mechanics and armor that encase what started out as a trooper all that time ago. The most prominent features on the Hulk are the pauldrons, chest armor, leg armor, and weapons. The chest armor is slanted downwards so as to deflect oncoming fire more effectively. It should be noted that this model is slightly inaccurate. The official image shows that there are 2 symbols present on the automaton. On the center, there is an automaton emblem, and on the right pauldron, there is the letter H from the automaton alphabet. I would of course presume that this stands for heavy, but it could have some kind of alternative meaning, as it is also seen on the Devastator. The pauldrons themselves are made of a red painted metal, which appears to be enhanced in comparison to the material that composes the rest of the body, specifically designed to deflect explosives such as thermite. Or at least, that is what's happened to me in my personal experience. On the top of the Hulk's main body, there are a set of 4 structures, which I would assume to be antennas. At first I thought they would be decoration, however they have small yellow heat sinks on them and have direct connections to the Hulk body. These may be used for remote communication with other sources like I mentioned earlier, or they may simply be used to expel more heat or something. I don't know, someone tell me in the comments please. One of the more weaker parts of its body is the heat sink that lies on its back. I would presume that such a large cooling mechanism would be needed so as to support the amount of power usage that such a unit would result in. Interestingly, the Jet Brigade variant of the Hulk has these heat sinks completely covered by the jetpack, which makes me think that the Jet Brigade variant of the Hulk uses the excess heat to power the jetpack mechanism. The Hulk's legs are pretty standard for an automaton unit, digitigrade in nature, and it has 3-toed feet for optimal stabilization and terrain traversal. This primarily mimics the foot structure of many birds in real life, in keeping with the digitigrade theme that has been seen so far. Now, one great point of interest on the Hulks is, of course, the weapons. There are 3 base Hulk variants that have different weapon combinations that correspond with their title. The Hulk Bruiser has a fusion autocannon for its right arm and a rocket launcher for its left arm. The Hulk Scorcher sports an alternative paint and decorative finish in line with the Berserker Devastator and utilizes a flamethrower and buzzsaw. Finally, the Hulk Obliterator, as its name suggests, is not necessarily the most dangerous Hulk to deal with, but definitely the most painful one. It uses dual rocket launchers and fires rockets at a higher rate than the Bruiser for maximum ragdolling efficiency. And it sports a flag atop its head to drive home the dominance that the Automaton Legion has in the field of ragdolling technology. Now, we can't talk about the Hulk without talking about its one eye. This eye is the ultimate weak spot of the Hulk. Just one well-placed shot to the eye with just about any weapon will instantly kill it. But don't be fooled. Once it's collapsed, it's time to start running, as this unit is set to automatically explode upon death after a few seconds. Whether intentional or a happy accident, this explosion alone makes Hulks one of the most deadly infantry units amongst the automatons, let alone everything else that they have in their arsenal. Alright, so as you probably know, the automatons love vehicles. You know who doesn't like vehicles? Me. So considering that these are not autonomous enough for me to call them organisms, I'm going to speed on through them. That's right, it's time for the Vehicular Automaton Lightning Round, a small little segment for units that didn't get their own segment. So, with that being said, Annihilator Tank, a generic tank with a heavy fusion cannon and a side gun. Shredder Tank, a lighter tank designed for suppressing fire and clearing large swaths of infantry. Barrager Tank, a tank designed for the same purpose as the Shredder Tank but at longer ranges and to an explosive extent. Gunship, a ship equipped with rockets and a fusion machine gun that looks terrifying but is actually very weak if you have the right weaponry. Dropship, same as the gunship, but with attachments that can carry automaton infantry. War Strider. I really just don't feel like talking about this guy. He might actually get his own video, not gonna lie. And so, that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. Did you really think that I would forget the greatest of the Automaton Legion? The unit that stands above all, the bot with the power to create others, the bot to end all bots until something bigger comes along? What bot, you may ask? The Factory Strider. The Factory Strider is the greatest of the automaton units. To start off, we first immediately see that it has digitigrade legs, a large body, and a small head, as well as multiple medium, heavy, and anti-tank armor plates. We also see that it has multiple eyes across its body. While at first you may only see the large one on its head that serves as a weak spot like the Hulk has, it also has one on each chin gun, along with some lights, and 2 on the cannon turret. Whether or not these are actually eyes is probably debatable, but considering that they look the exact same and are all strategically placed in locations where an individual would want eyes to be, I will go with this theory. The Factory Strider also has 3 small pieces of armor at its lower leg and foot, which are the exact same as the ones on the War Strider. This has the potential to indicate that these two are directly related. The primary ability the Factory Strider is made for is to remotely manufacture Devastators. I believe this to be one of the cornerstones of automaton invasions, especially in situations in which a particular swiftness is necessary. See, the Factory Strider is capable of birthing 4 Devastators per minute. At first, this doesn't sound like a lot, but that's 5,760 Devastators per day. That means, in a single week of 7 standard Super Earth days, a Factory Strider will produce 40,320 Devastators. Again, for a whole planet, this doesn't seem like much, but all the Automaton Legion would need to do is deploy 100 Factory Striders, and suddenly, they gain 4 million Devastators per week. And that's not including the countless other remote factories that will produce troopers, which can seemingly also be set up on a whim. Without a shadow of a doubt, the Factory Strider is strategically the most productive automaton that there is. Don't be fooled though when looking at this unit's primary use as a utility. It can be a deadly weapon, often deployed into active combat. The Factory Strider is equipped with a slightly modified version of the fusion cannon turret, the most powerful fusion weapon on the ground that we currently know of, and dual fusion Gatling guns. Now earlier I said that the Heavy Devastator was one of the most powerful automatons of the Devastator ranks. This is primarily because, while we don't often think of it, plasma weapons are actually extremely powerful. If the automatons had the capability to be as accurate in their shots as most Helldivers, or even most SIIIKKEE troopers, the war, on ground infantry operations at least, would be a piece of cake for them. Essentially, any automaton unit from the weakest of troopers to the largest of hulks has the capability to end a Helldiver with only a few plasma shots. With this in mind, you could imagine that, considering how inaccurate the automatons are, that basing weapons around a flurry of plasma bolts would be the most optimal solution to combat. However, I think this likely cannot be done due to power constraints, as automatons are seen frequently cooling their weapons, even when slow firing. The Factory Strider has no such limitation though. A larger size means larger and a higher amount of heat sinks and cooling vents, and that's what we see, across its entire body from its lower legs to even the top of its head. This is what I believe allows the unit to fire what may be hundreds of plasma bolts at once. A theory about the Factory Strider that I would also like to propose is that it may be an automaton which has been further upgraded. This is probably likely to be untrue, maybe, but if it was, then the Factory Strider would also have the most honored position of the automatons, being the most covered in mechanics. This would play into some kind of theme of the Factory Strider being a kind of mother to the automatons or something. This is all speculation though, as the only real piece of evidence for this is the fact that Factory Striders chant with the automatons in their marching cadence. So, we have finally arrived at the end of the video. The first thing a lot of you guys are probably wondering is, what about the Jet Brigade and Incineration Corps? And, well, upon close inspection, they're really just reskins of the current automatons. Maybe they'll get their own videos, but it's unlikely, as this really isn't my expertise in the first place. And that brings me to the next part of this Afterword. I have not really invested too much time into researching the mechanical. As you know, if you're a fan of my channel, I am heavily invested and biased towards biology, and because of that, I approached this video looking at mechanical beings under a mostly non-mechanical lens. With that in mind, if any of you may be qualified, whether that be through occupation or long-standing research, to speak on this topic, then please, I implore you to add to the discourse in these comments. With that out of the way, thank you everyone so much for watching this video. This is, once again, the longest video that I have ever written, even the longest piece of literature I have ever written in my entire lifespan. So I just want to thank you guys so much, all 4,000 of you guys, oh my goodness, it's like there's so many of you, for watching my videos and making the conscious decision to subscribe to my channel. Also, another YouTuber you might know, SLAYDEN'S, is going to be uploading his own video about the automatons around this time, so go check it out once it releases. Finally, I hope my videos have served as encouragement for other individuals to look at the games they play with greater detail, so as to enjoy them all the more. With that being said, thanks for watching, and goodbye.